For most people, the world today feels unpredictable. Tensions are rising, institutions are weakening, and the global system appears to be shifting in ways that are hard to understand. But when you zoom out, when you study centuries instead of years, you begin to see that none of this is new. The same forces shaping today's world have shaped every major transition of the last 500 years. And once you recognize the pattern, the future becomes far clearer than it seems. Every world order follows a cycle. The Dutch dominated the 1600s. The British shaped the 1700s and 1800s. The Americans led the 1900s. And now China is emerging as the next great competitor of the 21st century. Different cultures, different leaders, different technologies, yet all of them followed the same rise, the same peak, and the same decline. World orders begin after major resets. The Dutch rose after their conflict with Spain, the British after the fall of Napoleon, and the American-led order began after World War II, when the United States held half of global industrial output and controlled most of the world's gold supply. This allowed America to establish the dollar as the world's reserve currency, a position that shaped global finance for nearly 8 decades. But history shows that dominance never lasts forever. Most world orders remain stable for 80 to 100 years. They peak for a few decades, and then slowly but predictably the cycle shifts, not because the empire becomes weak, but because success begins to erode the very qualities that created its strength. In the early stages, nations are disciplined. They innovate rapidly. They save more than they spend. They build stronger institutions. They work harder than the world expects. That's how the Dutch revolutionized global trade. That's how Britain built the Industrial Revolution. And that's how America created the modern technological age. But as nations grow rich, their behavior changes. Savings decline, debt grows, hard work gives way to entitlement, political unity fragments into polarization, and the institutions that once held the society together begin to weaken. Today, the United States is experiencing these classic late-stage symptoms. Debt has surpassed 120% of GDP, levels not seen since the end of World War II. The money supply expanded by nearly 40% between 2020 and 2022, the fastest increase in modern American history. Political divisions have reached levels last seen in the 1960s, and wealth inequality has returned to extremes not witnessed since the Gilded Age. None of this is unique. These are the same pressures seen in every declining empire across the last 5 centuries. But world orders don't shift simply because one nation fades. They shift because another nation rises at the same time, a nation that is more unified, more productive, and more long-term in its strategy. Today, that rising nation is China. Measured by purchasing power, China's economy has already surpassed that of the United States. It leads the world in manufacturing output. It graduates more engineers each year than the United States, Japan, and Germany combined. And through its Belt and Road Initiative, it has extended influence into more than 140 nations, resembling the early global expansion of previous rising empires. If you're still here, it means you're not listening casually. You're looking for structure, clarity, and truth in a world that feels increasingly unstable, and for that reason, stay connected. Understanding these patterns is not optional anymore, it's essential. The next stage of the cycle is approaching, and it is the most consequential phase in the rise and fall of every world order. What comes next is the transition, the moment where the old order weakens and the new one becomes impossible to ignore. When a world order enters the transition stage, the signs are subtle at first. Productivity slows, debt levels rise faster than income, institutions lose efficiency, and the political system becomes more focused on internal conflict than long-term progress. These may look like isolated problems, but they are part of a structural shift, a shift that has repeated itself in every major empire over the last 5 centuries. The first clear sign of transition is financial imbalance. Throughout history, dominant powers fall into the same trap. They borrow heavily to maintain their influence. The Dutch did it in the late 1600s, the British in the early 1900s, and the United States over the last 3 decades. Today, America's total debt, public and private, has crossed $90 trillion, a level no previous empire has sustained without major adjustments. When debt grows faster than productivity, economies enter what economists call the late cycle phase, where stimulus becomes less effective, growth becomes unstable, and monetary tools no longer work the way they used to. The second sign is internal polarization. As wealth concentrates and economic mobility slows, societies turn inward. Groups blame each other. Political identities harden. National unity weakens. This is not a modern problem. It is a historical one. The Dutch experienced deep political division before losing their position to Britain. Britain faced severe class conflict before the rise of the United States. And today, the U.S. is experiencing polarization at levels measured only during the Civil Rights era and the Great Depression. When a nation fights itself, it becomes vulnerable to forces outside its borders. The third sign of transition is the emergence of a credible, rising power, a challenger that mirrors the early discipline, productivity, and long-term vision that the declining empire once possessed. In the 1700s, Britain was that rising power behind the Dutch. In the 1900s, the United States was that rising power behind Britain, and today China is that rising power behind the United States. China's rise did not happen suddenly. It happened through decades of consistent policy. Between 1990 and 2020, China lifted 800 million people out of poverty, expanded its economy nearly 40 times, and became the world's largest trading nation. Its Belt and Road Initiative connects Asia, Africa, and Europe through ports, railways, and digital infrastructure, resembling the trade networks built by past rising empires. Its strategy is long-term, extending not years, but generations ahead. But transitions rarely happen peacefully. History shows that when a dominant power feels its leadership challenged, tensions rise, even if both nations prefer stability. This is the stage where competition shifts from economic to strategic. In the modern world, this competition is visible in several areas: in technology, through semiconductor restrictions and AI race; in trade, through tariffs and supply chain realignment; in currency, through attempts to diversify away from the US dollar; and in geopolitics, through rising influence in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Yet the most important battles of a changing world order are not fought with armies. They are fought with standards, alliances, and systems. The British maintained dominance because their system was global. America maintained dominance because the dollar system became the backbone of world finance. And China's rise is driven not only by its economy, but by its ability to build an alternative network of infrastructure, trade routes, and financial partnerships. If you are still listening, it means you understand the importance of clarity in a time of confusion. It means you recognize that the world is not drifting randomly. It is moving along a predictable historical path. And this understanding gives you an advantage that most people will never have. Stay connected to these patterns, because the next phase of the transition is not gradual, it is sudden. World orders shift slowly until they don't. They weaken quietly until a single moment reveals the new reality. And that moment, whatever form it takes, reshapes the world for decades to come. In part 3, we will look at the most critical question of all: what the next decades will actually look like, and what history warns us to expect. As we look toward the decades ahead, history offers its clearest warning. Transitions between world orders are rarely smooth. They unfold slowly at first, almost unnoticed, and then accelerate suddenly when critical thresholds are crossed. The late stages of an empire's cycle always bring the same pressures: economic strain, political fragmentation, social fatigue, and rising external competition. These forces interact, amplify, and eventually reshape the global system. One of the most important signals of a changing world order is the decline of a reserve currency. The Dutch guilder lost its dominance in the late 1700s. The British pound slowly weakened through 2 world wars and finally ceded leadership after 1945. Today, the US dollar still holds unmatched global influence, representing about 59% of global reserves, but that share has been declining steadily from its peak of over 70% 2 decades ago. Several nations are now diversifying into gold, yuan, and regional currencies, behaviors that historically appear only when trust in the dominant system begins to weaken. Another warning sign is geopolitical realignment. Previous world orders also saw alliances shift as nations positioned themselves between the declining and rising powers. During Britain's decline, countries aligned either with London or Washington. Today, a similar pattern is emerging. Some nations lean toward the U.S. security network, others lean toward China's economic network, and a growing number prefer to stand in the middle, balancing between the two spheres. This fragmentation signals the erosion of a single global system and the formation of multiple regional powers, a hallmark of late-cycle transitions. The next decades will be shaped by competition not only in economics and diplomacy, but in technology itself. Artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, quantum computing, biotechnology, and energy innovation will determine which nations lead and which nations follow. In previous eras, power shifted with the steam engine, electricity, and the microchip. In our era, it will shift with data. Nations that control data flows and semiconductor production will hold the leverage once reserved for navies and armies. This is why the U.S.-China chip war is not an industry dispute. It is a struggle for technological dominance in the new global era. But the greatest risks ahead are not external, they are internal. Empires at this stage often face deep social stress, rising inequality, declining trust, political extremism, and cultural fragmentation. These internal conflicts weaken a nation's ability to manage external challenges. The Dutch faced this before their decline, the British before theirs, and America today faces similar divisions, economic, ideological, and generational. History shows that nations who rebuild internal unity can extend their leadership. Those who fail to do so accelerate their decline. Yet even in moments of uncertainty, transitions bring opportunity. New industries emerge, new markets open, new leaders rise. The world becomes more dynamic, more flexible, and more open to reinvention. The story of each new world order begins in the ashes of the old, built by those who understood the shift early and positioned themselves for the next era of growth. If you're still listening, it means you are among the few who seek understanding instead of distraction. In a world full of noise, you are choosing clarity. In a time of confusion, you are choosing awareness. That alone sets you apart. Stay connected to this perspective. These cycles shape nations, markets, and lives, and understanding them is the first step to navigating the future with confidence. The decades ahead will challenge old assumptions. They will test institutions, alliances, and identities, but they will also open the door to transformations that define a new global age. The Dutch built the age of trade, the British built the age of industry, America built the age of technology, and now the world stands at the threshold of a new era, an age driven by data, networks, and the shifting balance of global power. World orders do not last forever. They evolve, they adapt, and when they hesitate, they are replaced. History is not repeating itself, it is warning us. The same forces that reshaped the world in past centuries are now reshaping it again. The question is not whether the world is changing. The question is whether we are prepared for the world that comes next.